All right. Um, our new seminar series includes a view of a movie. And with families with biracial children, we were given the opportunity to watch Loving. I don't know how many of you had an opportunity to watch Loving, but I saw it back in 2016. And I recall being simply enchanted with the love stories. For me, the love story wasn't just Mildred Jeter and Richard Loving, but also, I'm sorry, someone's trying to get in. Also, the love story from the ACLU attorneys who had a love of the law and a love of liberty and justice for all. And so I was enchanted doubly and really, really enjoyed the movie. I hope you did too. I have the opportunity to introduce you to six people. And I have to say, honestly, they are six of my favorite people. They are not only lawyers and a therapist, they're guardians ad litem, mediators, they're parents. Honestly, they are parents of biracial children. So they come before us uniquely situated to address the topic that we deal with today. And there's no more appropriate name for a case than Loving versus Virginia. You may recall this case was handed down in 1967. And I'm going to scroll through these really quickly so that our speakers have more of an opportunity to share the wealth of knowledge that they bring to us today. But you may have recalled that the background of this case included Mildred Jeter, who was a Black woman, and Mildred married her sweetheart, Richard Loving. And Virginia precluded interracial marriage. And so they went to DC and married and returned to Virginia, and there they were arrested. They left Virginia and made a home in DC and simply returned once again to visit and were again arrested, at which point in time, Mildred reached out to then Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, and he sent them to the ACLU. And history was made. There were some really odd arguments that were tendered by Virginia, including one that related to the continental situation. And that is that God put Black, white, yellow, red people on different continents and therefore intended that they not join via interracial marriage. And so they should not be allowed to marry. They also thought that it was important to note that both the Black person and white person were equally punished the same. And so that they thought added fodder to their argument. The court held essentially that marriage is one of the basic civil rights of man, and the freedom to marry or not marry a person of another race lies with the individual and can't be infringed upon by the state. And so that set the stage for interracial marriage, Loving, and then moved on to be quoted in Obergefell, which was a seminal case allowing same-sex marriage. You might be interested to know that many people who were involved in same-sex relationships and wanted to be married also traveled to a different state to be married when their home state didn't allow same. Also, courtesy of Alice Limehouse, a fun fact, June 12th is known as Loving Day. So now I am going to have the panelists introduce themselves, and they'll tell you about their professional endeavors, and you'll see a photograph of their family. And for purposes of this evening, they're going to share their hearts, and they're going to share it through their stories, but they're also going to tell us how their children identify. And you'll find that that is important. And so we'll begin with Jonathan Dann. Jonathan?
Hi, thank you, Ivory. This is my version of a 1950s get up. I've got the background for 1950s Riviera, 60s golden era of Hollywood, and then I'm sporting a 50s 60s shirt. But that's my beautiful family, and I am fortunate enough to have been with my wife now for 20 years. Been married just shy of that, but we've been together for 20, and those are our boys. We have Hunter, who's 17, and Stuart, who is 10. And I don't know how far you want me to go and introduce myself, but that's my family, and I'm happy to share a little bit more when the time's appropriate.
Thank you so much. Rosalind Grant Holcomb. Rosalind?
Hello, everyone. I'm so happy to see you all, even if it's just virtual. I am Rosalind Grant Holcomb. I have been an attorney, a judge, a mediator, a guardian ad litem. I love advocating for our families, and I am sharing my heart with you all tonight. This is a picture of my husband, Alan, and I, who've been married for 4 years, and our little one, Allison, who is 2.5 years old. So,
Thank you, Rosalind. Andrea Johnson.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Andrea Johnson. I am an attorney. I serve as a guardian ad litem, and I think perhaps the most significant role that makes me think about the topic we're talking about has been my role as a child advocate lawyer with some of the juvenile courts. The picture you see there are my 2 boys, Broderick is my husband, and together we have Dante and Ethan. We'll be celebrating 22 years together this summer.
Thank you. Danielle Johnson.
Hi, everyone. I'm Danielle Johnson. Eric and I, my husband and I have been together for 26 years. We've been married for 18 years. We're raising our 3 daughters here in West Cobb. The twins are ages 14, and the youngest one, who was holding a little kitty cat in the middle, she is 13 years of age. My husband, since the beginning, has always walked around the house with a shirt that says "Color Me Human." That's pretty much what we've already instilled in our children. So if you ask them what they identify as, they will say both. So that's my story.
Thank you. Alice Limehouse.
Hey everyone, I'm Alice Limehouse. I'm an attorney, a mediator, guardian ad litem, parent coordinator, and I do some arbitration as well. This is my family. My husband, Drew, and I have been married for almost 8 years. He's my children's stepfather. My children are Phoebe, who is 22, and Caleb, with a K, who is 16. Phoebe is about to graduate from Howard University in May, so I feel like I need to be a proud mama for a moment. Very excited for her. I asked my children as well how they identify, and my daughter said that she brought it to where you have to select a race, whether it's on a standardized test or any type of form where you have to select a race. She said, I always pick Black on the forms. She doesn't pick mixed racial or, other or any of the other options. She says, I always pick Black on the forms. My son almost thought it was a silly question because he just looked at me and he's like, Mom, I'm Black. Like how, what else would I be? So that's been their experience. And that's also our 4-legged guy, Baxter, who's in the middle there.
All of your families are beautiful. And then our therapist expert for the evening, Rochelle Kennedy.
Hi, nice to meet you. Thank you for allowing me to join this panel. I am a therapist. I've been in the field since '07. I have worked in different settings. I've worked with juvenile court, DFACS, in-home. I've also worked at hospitals. I currently do private practice. I am biracial and of an interracial marriage, who also my parents separated when I was 2, and then custody issues and adopted by my aunt, who is on my dad's side. And so coming from New Jersey into Georgia was a little bit of a challenge with identity, coming from a place where, I didn't really know, I knew I was mixed, but it wasn't a thing. And then coming to Georgia and feeling like you have to choose. was challenging and kind of going through my own identity and self-identity work. I've always have been interested in working with individuals who are biracial because I wanted to understand the challenges as well. So thank you too for allowing me to kind of share my personal story and my experience with working with custody cases and things like that.
Welcome. We're glad to have you. We're talking about race, and we're talking specifically about biracial children, but we probably should be calling this multiracial. But we're having honest conversations today, and we're talking black and white. And you're going to find that even within black and white, and we're using those harsh terms. We're not sugarcoating it. We're not being politically correct, or I am not. I'm using the terms black and white, but you're going to find that there's gray, even in these considerations between parties or with families that have biracial children. You're going to note that our panelist responses will differ. Maybe they're going to differ by virtue of where they live, or by virtue of the race and gender of the parent, or the age and gender of the child. What you will take away is that every family is different, every parent is different, and every child is different. And through this conversation, we're hoping to change the difference and remove the otherness and embrace the entirety. I told you how difficult I thought it must have been for biracial children to exist in 2020. We're going to take a look at how the courts actually are going to consider or should consider race in custody cases. Let's start with Jonathan. Jonathan, in Loving, we know that the courts dealt with interracial marriages. You practice family law. You are the parent of biracial children. In Chatham County, do you think that the courts would address race when considering a custody dispute involving biracial children?
I think they would. It would be a little more implicit. I think they would be uncomfortable in Chatham County. Some of our judges, especially the more progressive judges, they're progressive, but they're from another generation. They would be uncomfortable expressly stating that they are making decisions based on race. But in fact, that would inform their determinations. I'm quite confident just based on my experience. And I think it would be a positive thing. They would try to be sensitive to that, but I don't think it would be, you're not going to find it in print or in the writing anywhere. You wouldn't even find any reference unless it became an issue, came into evidence in some fashion, in the form of a text message or communication. You wouldn't find any reference to the race of the parties in the case whatsoever.
Alice, you operate as a mediator, guardian, parenting coordinator. Would the courts consider, or should the courts consider race in a custody dispute?
I think it really has to depend on the circumstances. One of the scenarios that stood out, and as we were discussing this panel and how to talk about it, is when there's a biracial family and one parent wants to relocate. So for example, if there's a white parent and a black parent and they've had this child in the urban area of Atlanta, but then one parent wants to relocate with that child to the white parent in particular wants to relocate with that child to an urban area, or I'm sorry, a rural area. And I think that people talked about cases where they had people wanting to relocate to Alabama and Mississippi. How would that impact that brown child being in that space with only white relatives, et cetera? So I think in those kinds of scenarios, it would be important for a guardian ad litem to explore that, not to ignore it, but really to explore it. And it could be that those people are perfectly lovely and it's going to be just fine, but you don't know that unless you explore it. And race needs to be part of that conversation. because a child's self-identity is so important and it's formed from such a young age. They need to have positive representations of themselves around them. They need to be held up. They don't need to be called names. And so I think as a guardian ad litem in particular, it is something that in some cases should be considered. It doesn't have to be all the time. I think that I want to echo that sometimes race isn't an issue with the couple. And so there's no need for it to be an issue in the case. But if it does come up, or if there are circumstances where it's appropriate, then it should certainly be investigated.
Danielle?
I think I would have to echo some of what Alice just said. I really think that it depends on the circumstances. To repeat what you said earlier, I don't think any child is the same as any other. And likewise, I think families are all unique. So I think that before you automatically jump in and say that you have to consider race because you're dealing with the placement of a biracial child, I think that's a presumption that shouldn't have to happen all the time. I think first you need to look at the dynamics of the circumstances and of the family. You look at, for example, the demographics of the residents and the neighborhoods in which they reside, or the demographics of the school that they attend, or whether or not race relations have actually been discussed in the household, and if so, how. I think you also have to look at the individual child too to see, how that child identifies him or herself, you know, or what culture does she or he tend to gravitate towards. So I think to automatically jump in and just presume that race should be a factor, I think that's contrary to where I think most of the case laws are kind of trending towards anyway, and that is to get away from all of the presumptions, whether it be based on gender or religion or sexual orientation, hopefully. So I think it just depends on the case.
We know that courts have actually considered race, and long ago, rulings that or custody decisions that actually were based solely on race were overturned. Rosalind,
Yes.
you actually did some research on some of the case law that we are referencing tonight. Give us a brief overview of what the courts have said with regard to race.
Okay, gladly. So this was the first time that I ever researched cases on this issue. I can tell you as a judicial officer in Fulton County, I think one of the things that I've been encouraged by the Black Lives Matter movement and all the things that have been going on recently is that I think as a society as a whole, we are all learning that it's okay to talk about race, and race can be relevant. And I would agree with Alice completely in that it's not always an issue, but oftentimes maybe it's not an issue between parents or in a household, but oftentimes it can bring up societal issues for the child in particular. So what I found in my research, in short, because I know our time is limited tonight, is that the courts have overwhelmingly said race can be considered in custody determinations. Race, in fact, race can be expressly considered, contemplated, written in your orders, as long as race is not the only determining factor. And I think any of us who've been doing this and do well at this in family law practice know that determining custody always involves multiple factors. It's never a one type issue or one type consideration situation. That's why we have our statute. That's why we have 1993 and a whole list of things that the judges and the courts can consider. So I think that we don't have to be afraid to add to that list in our minds, whether it's express or implied race.
Race is not a dirty word. race can be considered in custody considerations. When we talked amongst ourselves prior to tonight, one prevailing word kept coming up, and that word was identification. And in the conversations, there were isolated 3 different factors that I denoted. And those were, one, how the world sees the child, how the parent sees the child, and thirdly, how the child sees him or herself. Let's talk about those factors, starting with how the world sees the child. And that may be the easiest one. And some of you may have heard the 1-drop rule, right? And Halle Berry actually used this argument in her custody dispute against her Canadian model father of her child. And Halle Berry is a Caucasian, a Black woman with a Caucasian or white mother and a Black father. But she identifies as a Black woman and said, my child, my daughter, is therefore Black. The child's father disagreed and had been accused of calling Halle Berry some racial slurs. But I'm going to stick with you, Rosalind. Do you believe that the 1-drop rule, or how the world looks at your child, is still in effect? Do people look at a biracial child as a Black child?
I'm going to start by sharing experiences in my own household. So I love my husband and my child dearly, obviously. But so my husband and I have this banter about our daughter. And so I always tease him. It's kind of like, it's a joke, not joke, but I often tell him our daughter is Black. She is a Black woman, even though if you noticed, she looks just like her dad. She's like his complexion. She's him totally. But I tell him that all the time, is that she's still a Black woman. And that's because I've long since known that rule. I'm born and raised in the South. So historically and traditionally, that's how the outside world has viewed mixed race children. If they had a drop of Black blood in them, they are Black. So, but what I understand and appreciate from listening to our other panelists who have older children is that it's also equally important to consider, and as far as how a parent sees a child, let me say this. I think all of our panelists will agree. You just see your child as your precious little angel that, I mean, you know they can do wrong, but you really feel like they can do no wrong because you're going to love them no matter what. So the parent's view is always through the lens of love, but that's not everyone else's view. So I'd say, I think some of the panelists who have older children can speak better to how their children have shared that they identify themselves. And my daughter, because she's still a toddler, she's not had an opportunity to share that with me yet. But my god baby, who is also biracial, has a Black mother and a white father. When I was pregnant, I was telling her I was so excited. I couldn't wait to see what our daughter looked like. And I think that's just natural for most mothers. But she looked at me and I said, she looked at me and she says, Rosalind, they're just gonna think she's Mexican. That's what they all think I'm Mexican. Everybody thinks I'm Mexican. She said they just come up to me and start speaking Spanish. So I just got a good laugh about that. And I just looked at her and said, you're probably right. So that's that. That's my 2 cents, Ivory.
Jonathan, you didn't have an opportunity to talk about how your children identify. And thank you, Rosalind, how your children identify. And we're now on the topic of how a parent sees a child. But before we go there, I want to hear how your children identify.
Sure. Well,
2 sons.
Absolutely. And my oldest, I know, identifies as light skinned, primarily Black. My youngest is more fluid. And that's just part of the privilege of his age group. He's 10. It's not as big of an issue. Now, I will say about the Mexican thing, that's kind of funny because he's something of a basketball phenom. And so word would get around about his basketball feats. And one of my friends, psychologist here in town, told me that he had heard about Stewart's basketball prowess, and the person who was describing him said, "It's the little Mexican looking guy." It's like, I think I know who you're talking about. He's not Mexican, but yeah, my friend was able to figure that out, who they meant, because he's got straight hair. My oldest has curlier hair. It's not really black or white. It's curly. And but my youngest son's hair is definitely what would be considered white hair or straight hair. It's wavy, but it would be considered white. But I do concur with Rosalind as far as the way the world sees them. It's the one drop rule. It's not, they're not white, whether they're Mexican or they're mixed or they're black. They're not considered white. And they both, my oldest does identify more closely as black. My youngest, it's more fluid, but he certainly avails himself of his black identity whenever any of his favorite athletes or movie stars or pop culture figures who are black happen to be mentioned. Then he's happy to claim that. He'll jump right in on that.
Thank you. So Jim Crow may still in part be alive and well, unfortunately in this day and age. And your responses have touched a little bit on another topic, and that is colorism, right? So those of you who know me know that I love pop culture, and you may have recognized when I dropped some lyrics from Toby, Catching a Wave, into my conversation. I'm now going to drop Halle Berry. What about Danny Lee? Danny Lee recently was in the news. She is Lil Baby's girlfriend, but she dropped a track about her boyfriend wanting a yellow bone. Okay? And Black women, Black men as a whole were incensed because she is a white woman. And so, colorism. It seems to me that it might be easier for people who have lighter skin and straighter hair to do what we're also going to talk about, which is passing. But let's talk about colorism. There's not just in American society, but societies across the land, the world, actually have placed a bonus on the beauty or the gauge of beauty by saying that a lighter person with straighter hair is more beautiful. That's the ideal of beauty. Do you think that factors in how your child, Danielle, identifies? Or your children, I'm sorry, your beautiful girls. Is it easier to identify as biracial if you are presenting in the world with a lighter hued skin?
Well, I mean, again, I have older children, not too much older, but the twins are going to be 15 and the youngest one is going to be 14 this year. They just have such a strong sense of identity for themselves. Um, they actually refuse to be characterized as anything. We've been at the doctor's office before. I was just with Claire, for example, at the doctor's office last month. She was being tested for COVID. Thank goodness it came back negative. But we were filling out this form, and she refused to answer the question, black, white, or other. We just skipped it. They they really haven't had that issue. I can tell you that Natalie, the other twin, she's of the lighter skin, but she does not like the idea of the so-called passing for white at all. She's very proud of both of sides of her, all sides of her, I should say. Um, and another thing, just to put out there as well, that race isn't just about the color of your skin. There's a whole rich culture that comes along with that. Culture that my children are exposed to. I think they should be exposed more often than I'm able to give them to. But when they are, they love it. They love sitting around with the aunts and uncles and hearing the same stories over and over again and having a competition who makes the best sweet potato pie or the potato salad. I mean, it's just there's a culture there that goes along with it. And I think that as far as colorism is concerned, my children, they really haven't had that experience yet because they have such a strong sense of who they are and everything else that that identifies them, and they just happen to have a black mom and a white father. It just doesn't phase them. I, I don't know how else to explain it.
Thank you. Thank you. I understand that. One of the um, really, really important books that I read last year was The Vanishing Act, and it's by Britt Bennett, and it'll be next on our book club read. But it was about twins who took different paths. They're from a city in Louisiana that simply had really, really light um, Black people, and that was their claim to fame. One of the twins lived her life as a Black woman, and the other lived her life as a, um, a white woman. And you get to share their journey. And it was a wonderful, compelling book. Rochelle, how important is it that we accept the a child's identification, even if it includes passing?
I think it's really important. I know, speaking from my own experience, moving from New Jersey, where even though neighborhoods were segregated, we still went to school with everybody. So different culture, I was surrounded by different cultures. Coming to Atlanta or Georgia, where at that time things were extremely segregated, so much that I lived in an all-Black neighborhood and was bused to a white school. So I was a part of M to M to mix. To mix the schools. And I think that the idea of passing, um, because I never, I couldn't fit in, right? So I couldn't be Black enough. And then I was clearly not white enough. And so that the colorism, I think, was very strong when I grew up. I think over the years, as more we integrate more and there's more interracial marriages and relationships, that is starting to loosen. But I do think that it is huge. And I think that the passing could go either way in regards to in elementary school, I tried to get my hair in cornrows and um, gel and trying to be as Black as I could, just to be able to fit in. And because grew up in an all predominantly Black neighborhood and people in my neighborhood didn't look like me. And so I think that it's not just trying to pass as white either, but it's trying to kind of pass as something just to feel like you belong. And to pathologize that, I think that it can really damage self-esteem. I think it's just really making sure that the child has a space to kind of talk about those things. Because my self-identity kind of was fluid. At a certain point, I was ashamed to acknowledge one race versus the other, depending on what setting I was. And it wasn't until I got older and kind of was able to establish my own identity as an individual, separate from my family and my neighborhood and friends, that I began to speak up more about being biracial and not just kind of assuming whatever identity somebody put on me.
That's important. Thank you. Thank you.
Can I echo one thing that Rachel was talking about, just in terms of psychology of things that you hear and just about colorism? Like, I'm nodding my head because I'm sure it was very difficult for her, because you feel like, I always remember reading about Mariah Carey and how she felt as a child back then, before it was more common to have biracial children or biracial people. And she was saying that she could never felt like she fit in with either side. But I remember one of the kind of backhanded compliments that I used to get as a child often around my Caucasian friends or colleagues as I got older would be, you're really pretty for a Black girl. And it just, like, especially in my adult life, how that sits with me when I think back about it. I never really, as a child, I really didn't know how to take it. but I knew it didn't. It felt weird. And as an adult, now I understand better why I was offended, or when people would say to me, particularly in certain successes in life, well, you're not like them, or you're not like other Black girls. And I'm like, I'm exactly like Black girls because this is me. So just the psychology of having that experience. And I remember the first time that someone sent me how they got the emojis, the color emojis finally. And my cousin sent me one and I was like, where did you find that brown thumb at? And then she was like, oh, just do this. Of course, she's younger than me, like college age. And she showed me and I was like, they got all the shades. This is awesome. And then I text one of my best friends, Beth, who's white. And I said, did you know that they have colored, emojis now? And I was like, I never even knew that I missed this until the joy that I felt to see the shades. So just wanted to chime in terms of Rachel's experience and mine.
Thank you. I appreciate your sharing your experience. It's one that I think that many people on this call have experienced, and thank you for sharing that and being inclusive. Let's talk about how the parent sees the child. Alice, can how the parent sees the child affect the way the child identifies? For instance, if you have a parent who is pro African American, can that influence a child? No, I should say, because I said I was going to tell the truth, pro Black. We've got a parent who is really engaging with the child in a way that focuses the child or encourages the child to identify as a Black person, or it could be the opposite, as a white person. Can the parent's view of the child really affect how the child identifies?
I think yes. I think that's absolutely a possibility. In my experience, my children's father and I had a very difficult marriage and a very difficult breaking up period that impacted my children a lot. And as it evolved, we ended up basically doing parallel parenting, and he and I did not interact with each other much at all. And if we did, it wasn't positive. Um, but the messaging that my children often got in his household was that he sort of drew a clear dichotomy between white people and Black people. White people do this, Black people do this. Black people don't do that. White people don't do that. And he also framed it in a way that made it clear to them that their loyalty to him included their identity as being Black children. And I don't think that they would necessarily articulate it that way themselves. But, I've seen it over the years, things that they say are words I've heard their father say. They're internalizing and echoing things that they've heard him say. And I'm not going to say, you're wrong. It's not, I'm not going to challenge that because I don't want to be disparaging to them of their dad. Regardless of our issues, he's still their dad. But I have tried to kind of live in a way that, I hope would broaden their horizons. And I think, it's all very complicated and there's multiple factors involved, but the bottom line is my children do identify as Black, and I'm really okay with that. That's really up to them. And it was very important for my daughter she graduated from Grady High School in Midtown, which has a lot of Black children and a lot of white children, not a lot of other children of other races. And the Black children tend to hang out with the Black children. The white children tend to hang out with the white children. And that was a big factor in my daughter's choice of attending an HBCU, was that she wanted to experience being in the majority. That was something that was important to her. And I'm super proud of it. But since I've mentioned it twice now, you probably figured that out. But
You're entitled.
but
You're entitled.
super
You're
proud of
entitled.
it. I almost wore my Howard Mom t-shirt for the panel, but you asked us to dress up. So
Next time, next time. Thank you for sharing that, and I appreciate that. You all have in common that you are supportive parents, and I think that that speaks volumes. Rochelle, what's the downside in a parent encouraging a child to identify with one race in lieu of embracing the other or both?
I mean, I think that there is a difference between kind of creating space and providing that child with information on what this particular race. I think it's a lot of times just because African Americans have been the minority and have experienced inequality and in the US especially, that I think it's important that the child be kind of aware of that information. And as I think the parent talk about their experiences, not necessarily one race is good and one race is bad, but just kind of like what it was, what their experience as African American was like in a majority culture of white. And I think as the white parent talking about their experience, but both of them are going to be separate from the biracial child's experience. And I think that is important, as well as creating space for everybody to have their individual experience and that being their experience and not putting it on anybody else, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you for that. Is simply identifying as one race a rejection of the other parent, Jonathan?
I don't believe that to be the case. That's certainly not been my experience with my oldest, who does seem to identify more closely as Black. Because, as I've said in our private conversations, I think that that decision was made for him by the culture. But no, I don't experience it as any kind of rejection. And he's also doesn't exactly have a binary model, because he's grown up around white people, and predominantly, he and his brother have been, one of a handful of people who aren't white everywhere they've been all their lives. And now in high school, there's a little more diversity. He goes to BC, which is a private Catholic military school. So there's a little more diversity there, and it's been good, because before that, coming up in school, socially, all of their interactions were almost exclusively with white kids, except sports, because they excel in sports and they play the AAU, and then suddenly there would be, they'd have friends that aren't 100% white. So they always had, they both enjoyed that kind of balance. But I think his life has a little bit more balance, because on a day-to-day basis, as opposed to just in the sports setting, he's around people that I say people that look like him. Can't think of any friends that he has that are biracial, but he does have friends that are across the spectrum. And that's been good. So I certainly don't experience as any kind of a rejection.
Thank you. Andrea?
I don't think that I would say that there is a rejection of one race if the child identifies as the other. I specifically had this conversation with my son, who is 20 years old. He's a junior in college. And after some of our conversations, I went to him and said, "What do you identify as?" And he said, "Mom, I'm always going to identify as biracial. But the world sees me as Black at some times. And at some times I'm not Black enough. And at other times I'm not white enough. So for his perspective, it depends on where he's at. But for him, you know, he said my identification, he would never, I don't think, diminish his relationship or his love towards either of us. But I do know that his identification has been very fluid over the years. We live in Forsyth County, and everybody knows what Forsyth County's history is. It is not super open to minorities of any kind, and certainly not super open to families that look like ours. So through their grade school years, my boys have had more white friends than black. But as my sons kind of experienced what 2020 was, their blackness became a big deal. And when I took my 20-year-old to vote in his first ever presidential election, he was wearing a shirt that said, "Stop killing us." He was very, very, very clearly identifying as a black man on that day and casting his voice as a black man. And it was not disrespectful to me. And in fact, it was one of the proudest days of my life, parenting a boy with brown skin.
Thank you. So in touching on how the child sees him or herself, we understand that it's shaped by the way the world sees the child, how the parent sees the child, and it can also be influenced by shades of colorism and passing. One parent can influence the child's identity forcefully, and we know that identifying with a certain race isn't necessarily a rejection of the other parent. Andrea, let's bring this home to the courtroom. You operate as a guardian ad litem. You are a practicing attorney. You are the proud mother of 2 sons. What 19-9-3 factors are present in a custody case with biracial children?
So for me, I think the most important factors, and quite frankly, unless we've got some really egregious misconduct on one side or the other, for me, one of the most significant factors, regardless of whether it's a race case or a case where parents are of the same cultural background, is how the parent is going to help facilitate the relationship with the child and the other parent. And I think for biracial children, that is a very, very, very significant factor. I do believe that as practitioners of the law, we owe it to our clients to educate the bench and not be afraid to go to the court and say, because this factor is specifically laid out in the statute, Your Honor, we're asking you to consider which of these parents is going to make sure that these children are more confident in themselves and in their identification, and that regardless of how they identify, that their interest as far as their psychological well-being with, you know, I mean, it is a psychological thing for these children. They have to identify. And while, you know, some of our panelists have said their children identify as humans, others have said as black. My children are very fluid, and at times they're white, and at times they're black, and at times they're biracial. And we need the courts to consider what environment is going to make that be okay and be the most okay. And I think that the courts have to consider, from my perspective, in families that look like mine, if I were to divorce my husband, I would expect my judge to consider which of us could place our children in the best arena to thrive. And that includes their identity. So for me, I think it is imperative that the courts consider race. And they may look at this and say, okay, we've got 2 parents who have done a fantastic job, but I think the consideration must be there. And if we don't have our bench looking at what's good for our kids and including who they are, then they're missing a huge piece of the picture. And these children are biracial. They've got one parent who looks one way, one who looks another. And quite frankly, these children don't look like either of their parents most of the time. And if the court can't recognize that as part of who they are, they're missing so much. And I think they're depriving the children of their opportunities to be who they are in a safe way.
Piggybacking on that, how important is it for the child to have access to both parents in dual households for that child to appropriately identify racially and to experience cultural immersion? How important is it that that child have access? And maybe this really touches a little bit on what Representative Clark was hoping to achieve by her bill. But Alice, how important do you think it is that the child have access to both parents? Can't hear you, Alice. Unmute yourself. Thank you.
I'm sorry.
And Alice, before you get started, we're going to stay the course until 7:15. Anybody who needs to drop off, we understand completely, but we allowed a little more time for addressing a legislative issue. So I think that we only have a couple more questions, but if people stay the course, we're going to go to 7:15. Go ahead, Alice.
I muted myself because I have the dog Baxter in the room with me, and he's starting to whimper a little bit. So I'm sorry about that. So as far as access to both parents, I think that it is very, very important that children experience, both sides of themselves or multiple sides of themselves, so they can see to sort of integrate that within themselves. I mean, one of the things that I really encouraged with my kids when they were little was that their auntie would pick them up and she would braid my daughter's hair, and they both just loved that experience. And so I think that it is important that children have exposure to multiple cultures, and I think that's especially important where the children themselves are multicultural.
Thank you. I do have a question with regard to the role of race in professional roles. How important do you think it is for people to consider the makeup of the family before them in selecting a mediator regarding ad litem? Rosalind.
Honestly, I'd say I think it depends on what the issues are in the case. I think Alice said early on that sometimes race is an issue in that case and sometimes it's not. And even though it's not exactly the same, but I will liken to and say and attest that in the last, let's just say, year serving as judicial officer, I noticed more and more that parents were having issues with sexual orientation and sexual and gender identification. And so I think, the same thing, if that's an issue in your case, if racial identification is an issue in the case, and it's something that the parents may be fighting about, and to echo what Andrea said, if you have one parent who's not willing to foster or encourage a relationship with the other parent and equally, I guess, place an emphasis on exposure to both sides of the biracial person's makeup, then, that's important. That's why you would need a mediator, or particularly a guardian ad litem, someone the court appoints to look into and investigate the issues in the case and report back to the court to consider that issue as well. And and you all know this. I mean, it's very rare that there's one issue in a case. Cases are always multifaceted, right? But if I know that it's an issue in a case and it's something, I need to know that the guardian ad litem, as a judge, I would have needed to know that the guardian ad litem would be comfortable expressly addressing that issue for me. I need to know that someone is comfortable saying, we have a Black boy that is moving to Forsyth County. And I feel like, Andrea, you've had maybe a case like this in front of me. I feel like maybe you had one, and I thought I was thinking about the issue and you expressly said it in one of your arguments. And I was like, thank you. It's the elephant in the room. It's at issue here. It matters. So yes, I want a guardian ad litem, particularly the guardians, because they're in the case for much longer than the mediators. But it's also helpful, as you know, particularly, let's just say if the parties themselves are not as comfortable talking about the issues with someone outside of their race. I think that we need to be cognizant of that in appointing mediators. I kind of liken it to years ago when I was at University of Georgia. I was a part of a hostess organization, and they would deliberately pair recruits with hostesses of the same race. And the presumption was that most people automatically felt more comfortable with people of the same race. Now, as you all know, that's not necessarily always true in every circumstance. Just as like my husband, he probably has more Black friends than white friends just naturally, but
I'm going to go to Rochelle now. Thank you, Rosalind.
Yes.
Rochelle, what about in the selection of a therapist? Should a biracial family look to a biracial therapist? Are there any special traits that you think that you might bring to the table that would be unique to that family and offer assistance?
It reminds me of a case that I worked with. I had a African-American male who was working in a custody case. The custody had already been decided, but there was high conflict. And he had been diagnosed as narcissistic and very aggressive. But reading through the reports, a lot of it had to do with cultural differences. The psychologist who assessed him was a white older man. And because my client presented as very guarded and very confident and demanding on certain things, he appeared to be narcissistic per the psychologist, which colored his whole interaction through the court system. And really, he was just kind of demanding what he thought was fair for his child, the proper treatment for his son. He was not. He was very confident, assertive, and so I think that is extremely important, especially with the high conflict cases. That you have it or find people who are culturally confident. They don't necessarily have to be biracial, but just have a cultural competency that they are not taking and like they are digging deeper than just what is presented, if that makes sense.
Thank you. I promised you all that I was going to allow you to give to the audience what you hoped they would receive from you. A practice tip, something that you hope that they would walk away with that they could take into their practice or their travels. And I want to start with you, Rosalind. I'm sorry, I think I cut you off when you were speaking last, and so I want to begin with you and allow you to give us what do you want the audience to leave with?
Just that it's okay to talk about race. Salt and Pepper had a song years ago. Let's talk about sex, baby. Let's talk about you and me. I feel the same way about race. Like, it is what it is. Just put it out there. It should be a consideration where it's relevant, and it's okay.
Thank you. Now, you know, when you drop some lyrics into your prose, I'm just a fan, super fan. Thank you. Alice?
I just want to impart that you can't make assumptions. You've got to check your biases. Particularly as a guardian ad litem coming into a case, it's very important to not just, you've got to look at the case as an individual family and the individual children.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Danielle?
I would just say that you can't come in with the presumption that a child should be placed with a parent that has the same race that society is going to identify the child as. I don't think that's fair to the non-minority parent. And I also think that it kind of perpetuates some of the connotations that you talked about earlier that I think that all of us are rejecting, such as the one drop rule and the brown paper bag rule and the concept of passing for white and all that. Those are connotations that have been in this country, 1920s and 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s. I think it's about time that we start walking away from that. And I think it's about time to start telling our children that they don't have to be, even though society is trying to pigeonhole them, they can fight that. They don't have to be, they don't have to accept any label that is just thrusted upon them. And I just don't think that such connotations have a place in our legal system anymore. And I think that especially when we're dealing with custody issues regarding children in 2021, I mean,
Thank you.
it's time.
Long overdue. Jonathan?
Thank you. And I certainly appreciate the perspective that at some point, I certainly want to teach my children that at some point, we hope to be able to transcend these issues. But if 2020 has taught us anything, it's taught us that as a community, as a country, as a people, our views on race relations are still aspirational. that would be generous, a kind way to put it. So I do think that it still has some bearing. And what I would just simply suggest, the takeaway would be go to the statute. You know, what we learned in law school, read the statute, read the statute, read the statute. So if you look at 1993, there's a couple of provisions which I think fit in nicely, and they've been referenced already. But subsection C, which has to do with, we always gloss over it because it's a capacity and disposition to give the child love, affection, and guidance, a circle of guidance. Yeah, that could be a factor. And then right under that, D, each parent's knowledge and familiarity with the child's needs. So I circled familiarity and needs there. And then one other provision that I thought would have unique bearing on multiracial, biracial families is subsection N, the willingness and ability of each of the parents to facilitate and encourage a close and continuing parent-child relationship between the child and the other parent. And certainly if you have a case where one parent has manifested hostility toward the other parents, you know, toward the entire race, that's something that you got to look at. So those are my suggestions as far as practice pointers. How would you discuss race in the courtroom in a way that fits within the parameters of our existing framework? And I think you can.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Certainly.
Andrea.
So for me, I think one of my great takeaways from 2020 was how unprepared as a white woman I had been to face some of the issues that Black men face. I grew up in a white household with 2 white parents. I went to a church that was almost entirely white. Every educational institution that I went to was almost primarily white. And I think that we need to be willing as practitioners to kind of educate those who are around us. I really did have a great awakening this year in dealing with some of these racial issues with a 20-year-old young man and a 14-year-old young man, and I wasn't ready for it. And I'm going to assume that most people who are not in my shoes aren't ready for it. And when I walk into a courtroom, I think that I want the judge to accept when I try to educate them about issues that may not be theirs. If you're not walking life with and doing life with people that are different from you, you truly can't see what they're feeling. And I think that, I guess for me, what I would want from this group, those of us who are practitioners, to be willing and brave enough to walk into a courtroom and share your client's experiences. We're going to have a custody case and we're talking about children. Those children's lives need to be understood by the man or woman who's about to make a decision for where they're going to live. And so I think we need to be brave. I think we need to be bold. And I think we need to understand that, guess what? It is wonderful to be Black. It is wonderful to be white, but it is also wonderful to be a little bit of both. And that we and our courts should embrace that, and they should be looking for what's good for those children. And we can't staple an exhibit AA that has every other weekend, or we can't go with a proposed new statute that's 50-50. It's got to be for those children. And to the bench, I would beg of you to hear what is individual in each case and to listen to what really matters to the children, not to the lawyers that are the most popular, not to the parent who's the most well-spoken, but to what's important to the children. I think Judge Davis commented earlier that he felt that that was his duty. I think that that's what I want people to take away, is that we have to be brave enough to share what is truly best for our clients, for the children.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Rochelle.
I don't know if I could add more to what everybody's already said. But it reminds me of, kind of speaking of the Lovings, but I was listening to Taraji Henson and on, I think she was on Breakfast Club, and she said to truly love somebody is to try to understand them. And I think that is the case, is just trying to understand everybody's experience in the cases, because everybody's experience is going to be different, right? The white parents' experience is going to be different from the Black parents' experience. That's going to be different from the biracial child experience. And all of them have relatable concepts, but everybody's experience is going to be completely different. And just creating room to try to lean in and understand each one and what's best for the child and kind of their development. which will not be a straight and narrow line. I mean, you can completely do everything that you can, and they're still going to struggle sometimes with identity because it's the society that we live in.
Thank you so much. It's been so encouraging to have a therapeutic viewpoint in addition to the gems that have been dropped by our attorneys. I know that one thing is certain, that your children are in good hands, and Rochelle, your clients are in good hands. I have had lyrics dropped today. I've had a social media pop culture reference from you, Rochelle. I swoon, I am in heaven. This has been a wonderful panel. I hope that the participants have enjoyed it and learned as much as I have. I do want to say that the Inclusion Committee is here for biracial families. And if you would like to establish a support group, we're here to help start that. And if you're interested, simply email me at familylawinclusion@gmail.com. And together with these panelists, we will form a place that is safe for you to share your thoughts, ideas, and provide support for each other. It's been wonderful, but that's all, folks. Have a lovely evening. Love wins. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to look at the chat. Everyone is saying thank you. Thank you, guys. It has been wonderful. We appreciate you. Stay tuned for November 23rd. I'm sorry, February 23rd. It will be Children of the African Diaspora. And if you are wondering how mothers and fathers are handling their Black sons and Black children, we're going to talk about that. So have a good evening, all. I'll talk to you soon.